All right. So, hi everyone. My name is Hoon Cho. I'm an assistant professor at Yale University in biomedical informatics and data science. And my background is in computer science, but I've been trained in computational biology mostly. And in my work, I focus on privacy enhancing technologies for biomedical data. And in this presentation, I'll be focusing on talking about our work on secure computation and genomics in particular. So I'm happy to be here to tell you about our work today. So as a brief overview, the high-level problem that we're trying to solve with our work is the fact that there are all these biomedical and genomic data that are stored in isolated silos that are difficult to pull together due to data privacy concerns that you're well familiar with. And as you know, secure computation techniques from cryptography, which includes homomorphic encryption, it provides a promising way to address this challenge by allowing us to analyze these multiple private data sets in a secure manner and protecting the privacy of these individual data sets. And the hope is that by using and developing and using these methods, we will be able to enable a new set of collaborative studies that are currently not possible. So this is what we do in our work, and in this talk, I'll walk you through our recent journey in this line of work. And I'll first talk about how we developed a secure alternative to centralized analysis for collaborative studies by using a technique called secure multi-party computation, or MPC, which has been mentioned in the previous session. And then after that, I'll talk about how in a more recent work, we explored this federated model of secure computation, which additionally leverages homomorphic encryption to improve scalability of these tools. And lastly, I'll briefly mention our recent work on real-world deployment of these tools in support of cross-biobank studies. And a lot of this work that we've done centers around this essential analysis task in genomics known as genome-wide association studies, or GWAS. And I think not all of us may be familiar with this on this call, so I'll briefly define what this is. So the high-level goal for GWAS is to find genetic variants that are linked to disease or other biological traits. And when I say genetic variants, what I mean is that what I mean are these positions in our genome that differ across different individuals. And the idea is that some of these differences will have biological significance and lead to different disease conditions down the road. And the idea is to look for these patterns that are statistically significantly correlated with the disease. And this is commonly done through GWAS. I'm showing you a standard model that's used for a statistical test for looking for these signals. So you can see the phenotype or disease status represented as Y here. This is typically written out as a linear expression, a combination of different effects. So there's going to be a genetic effect term that looks at a particular letter at a specific position in the genome with some unknown effect size parameter here shown as beta. There will be other covariates in the model, like age and sex and other demographic information that could also have an impact on the phenotype. And of course, there's this environmental noise factor because there's a lot of noise in the high-level phenotypes, which is typically modeled as a Gaussian variable. And the goal is to test whether this effect size on the genetic effect term is non-zero, meaning that the position that we're looking at has a significant impact on the disease. So based on this model, we scan across the genome to test for the significance of many, many variants, typically in the millions. And this gives us a view into the genetic signals that underlie a biological condition. And since we're running statistical tests, it's not hard to imagine that we need large sample sizes to obtain enough statistical power to detect small but meaningful biological signals. And this is especially important when we're looking at rare medical conditions where study recruitment can be difficult, or when we're trying to look for these patterns that can benefit a diverse group of individuals, given that some of these genetic variants only appear in specific populations. And moreover, as these more complex statistical and machine learning models become more widely adopted in the analysis of these genetic data, the need to collect larger and more diverse data sets will continue to grow. But of course, the problem is that sharing these genomic and clinical data across different sites can be difficult, as you know, due to privacy concerns. So in our initial work, we turned to this cryptographic technique of secure multi-party computation, as I mentioned, or MPC. I think it's worth briefly going over the concept behind this, since it's different from HE or homomorphic encryption. So the core technique here is what's called secret sharing, which takes a piece of private data, splits it into multiple parts, which are called secret shares. These shares are distributed among multiple parties. The idea is that each of these shares will look completely random. It doesn't encode any information on its own about the private data, but if you take all these shares together, we know what the private value is. And given this distributed encoding of private information, we're able to perform certain types of interactive operations to perform computations on the private data without revealing any private information during this process. And this is typically interactive, meaning that the parties are exchanging messages to carry out this protocol. But this is all done in a secure way. And at the end, when we have the shares for the analysis results that we want to reveal, we can combine the shares then to return the output to the collaborators. Now, this is just like HE, a general purpose technique that can be applied to different types of analyses, but it also has a similar limitation that when we try to take this framework and apply it to complex and large scale data analyses that are common in genomics, it starts to run into issues regarding scalability. It incurs high computational and communication costs. So in our initial work, we figured out a way to do this computation in a more efficient way. I won't go into the details here. And we tailored the method for the GWAS pipeline. I'm showing you the system overview here, which is essentially what I just described earlier. We start with a collection of private data sets that are secret shared across different computing parties. They run some interactive computation to run GWAS, and the results are reconstructed at the end. And the key point here is that we were able to support all of the standard analysis steps in a GWAS, so including quality control, the step called population stratification analysis, which involves a complex linear algebra operation called principal component analysis. And it turned out this is the computational bottleneck of this pipeline, at least in our setting. So that was one of our major contributions here. And overall, we were able to show that this pipeline is able to analyze private data in a secure manner with high accuracy and with efficient runtimes. So I'm showing you one example here, example GWAS data set for disease condition called AMD or macular degeneration. You can see that the accuracy or the results that we get from our pipeline closely matches with the ground truth computed on the raw data. And this is showing the runtime across different data set sizes. Black line is total. The other lines are individual components in this pipeline. For data sets including tens of thousands of individuals, the runtime is in the order of a few days. So it's quite practically feasible. And in a subsequent work, we were able to extend these techniques to a different biomedical task where we try to predict interactions between drug compounds and protein molecules to support drug repurposing tasks. And this is done by training a neural network model securely across multiple collaborating entities using the same MPC framework that I described earlier. I won't go into much detail on this work, as I've been told that my former PhD advisor, Dr. Bonnie Berger at MIT, might cover this work as well in her presentation in a future session. So I'll leave it at that. But we were excited when we worked on this that we're able to take this technique and apply to different types of biomedical analyses because it's fairly general. Now, despite these promising initial results, we did want to improve upon our methodology further due to the following limitations. So the runtime numbers that I mentioned earlier in the order of days for tens of thousands of individuals. Now, that's great for those data set sizes, but it turns out lately we're, you know, seeing these much larger data sets that include hundreds of thousands of individuals. And at that scale, the runtime starts to become a little more challenging in the order of weeks. So we wanted to reduce that further. And this technique of secret sharing, even though it is a secure way of representing private data across multiple parties, it is quite challenging in the sense that we need to take the entire private data set split it into multiple shares, and distribute it among multiple parties. So even though it's secure, it incurs high computational or communication costs. And the other limitation is that in our work, we supported this standard GWAS pipeline involving the principal component analysis or PCA step that I mentioned. But there are other types of GWAS methods that are also commonly used in genetic studies, and we wanted to be able to support those as well. So in order to address these challenges, we next turn to a federated model of secure computation. And by federated, what I mean is that uh, unlike in the original MPC setting where we, as I said, take the entire data set, split it into multiple shares, we're going to keep each of those private data sets local to each data holder and only share smaller amounts of intermediate data between the parties in an encrypted form. And I will clarify further on this idea in a later slide. And this is helpful because now we're not moving the entire private data sets. Um, and so it reduces communication costs, but it also improves computational scalability because when these individual parties perform a computation on their end, they're now able to use their local unencrypted data, which tends to be a lot faster than working with encrypted data. So to be able to work with this new framework, we had to leverage homomorphic encryption. And in particular, we use a multi-party extension of HE called MHE. And this is in collaboration with Dr. JP Cuba at EPFL and TuneInsight, who's on the call today. So the key idea here is to take the decryption key of an HE scheme and split it using the same secret sharing technique that I mentioned across multiple parties. So this means that no one party has access to the decryption key. On the other hand, the other types of keys in the system, so encryption key and evaluation keys, which are needed to perform homomorphic operations on the encrypted data, these are commonly shared by all the participating entities. And what this new way of key sharing means for us is that uh, since everyone has access to encryption and evaluation keys, anyone can encrypt a new piece of data, perform operations over encrypted data. But because the decryption key is hidden now and secret shared, all of the parties that are involved need to cooperate to be able to decrypt any piece of data. And in our case, this will only be the final results that we agree upon to release at the end. The other important property of this is that because now we have a collection of parties in the system, we're able to leverage interactive computation too, in addition to sort of the more conventional HE operations. So for example, the bootstrapping step, which tends to be the bottleneck in HE protocols, this could be replaced with a more lightweight interactive protocol that we use in our protocols. And in addition, we can additionally switch between HE operations and the MPC operations that I mentioned earlier um, by changing the encoding of the data that we're working with as we go. And this is beneficial because each of these frameworks has their strengths and weaknesses when it comes to the types of operations that they're able to handle effectively. So the key insight that we leverage in our work is that this MHE framework allows us to work with things in a with the data in a federated manner. So let me clarify what this looks like in an example workflow. So in the beginning, as I mentioned, we have these large private data sets that are held by individual entities. They're going to be performing some initial local computation. There's no encryption involved here to produce an initial set of intermediate data. And they'll engage in the first round of interactive computation. So this could be simply aggregating the locally computed results or applying some nonlinear operations on these data using interactive protocols. And after that, the results are distributed among the parties. This remains encrypted using HE. And then the parties engage in the next round of local computation. And this time, in addition to their local private data, they have access to the results of this interactive computation, right? So now they can further progress in the analysis pipeline and produce the next set of intermediate results. And we repeat this process until we're able to compute the desired analysis globally across everyone. And only at the end do we reveal the analysis results uh, by having all the parties cooperate to decrypt the encrypted data. So note how we're keeping the original input private data locally to each party, and everything that's shared between the parties are encrypted using MHC. So what we did in our work is we took this framework and completely redesigned the GWAS protocol that I mentioned earlier using this federated technique. And the resulting method is called Secure Federated GWAS or SFGWAS. Here I'm showing you the runtime benchmark across three data sets that we used in our previous work as well. And the black bars indicate the total runtime. The colored ones are the individual components. You can see that we get a pretty significant improvement in runtime compared to our previous MPC-only solution. For example, for the AMD dataset, which is the one that I showed you earlier, we're taking the runtime down from around 3 days to around 5 hours. So it's almost an order of magnitude improvement. And this scalability improvement now allowed us to apply our techniques to very large Biobank scale data sets. I'm showing you two examples here, eMERGE and UK Biobank data sets, including up to 276,000 individuals for UK Biobank. We split each of these data across 6 or 7 simulated data centers according to the original data collection sites. And we applied our SFGWAS method to jointly analyze all of these data without sharing any private information between the parties. The results are shown at the bottom. If you haven't seen these plots before, it's what's called Manhattan plots. It's a common way of plotting GWAS results where you see the individual genetic variants along the x-axis, and the y-axis shows the statistical significance of a particular genetic variant, saying that it's, whether it's correlated with the disease or not. Um, so you can see that the results closely match with a centralized pipeline without any privacy techniques. The runtime for both these data sets, it was 1 hour, around 1 day for eMERGE and around 5 days for UK Biobank. So these are not cheap protocols in terms of runtime, but they're still practically feasible, and we could further reduce them if we use more computational resources. One thing that I want to highlight is that this UK Biobank data is actually 2,000 times larger than the largest data set that we analyzed in our previous work. So we're really pushing the scale of these data sets in this work. I will also mention that in the SFGWAS work, we added a new workflow that can handle a more advanced GWAS protocol. So the ones that I've shown you before are based on what I refer to as PCA-based GWAS, where we use PCA to look for these ancestry structure covariates in the data set, include them in the model for the association tests to correct for any possible confounding due to population structure. It's known that we can replace this fixed effect term, meaning that the values are observed, with a random variable here shown as G. And this is called a random effect term, meaning that the precise values of these variables is considered unobserved, but we put a distribution over this, and the covariance is set to the genetic relatedness matrix, which we can directly compute on the study cohort. And this is known to be a more fine-grained way of modeling genetic relatedness within the study cohort and could lead to more accurate GWAS results. So it's been widely used in recent studies. The trouble is that this is a more complex statistical model, and being able to infer these parameters takes a lot more effort, even without applying any encryption. What we observed in our work is that this latest method for LMM-based GWAS, oh, by the way, this approach is called linear mixed model, or LMM. So there's this recent method called Regini, where the authors have took this approximation approach, where this variable is replaced with the whole genome regression model to approximate the effects of this random genetic effect. And it turns out this is a more tractable way of solving this problem that also matches the accuracy pretty well with existing LLM methods. And we were able to take this new approach and map it to the secure federated setting by implementing it using the MHE operations that I mentioned earlier. And again, uh, given the interest of time, I won't go into the technical details here, but I do want to emphasize that being able to restructure the algorithm that we're implementing to make it more amenable for efficient cryptographic operation, given all of the constraints that these operations come with, is important for achieving practical runtimes with these types of work. So this is one example that we had to address in our LMM work. I'm showing you two curves here, plotting runtime across different dataset sizes. The blue one is what would happen if we were to simply took the Virginia approach, implement it using MHE. You can see that the runtime starts to blow up for large dataset sizes. But with our reformulation of the problem, where we're able to maximize computation over the unencrypted data for really expensive operations like matrix inverse, we're actually able to bring this down quite significantly, almost by a factor of 10 at this large dataset size, and obtain an almost near constant scaling of runtime and dataset size as well. So for all of these different dataset sizes, our runtime stays under a few days. And based on this, we're able to have practical performance for biobank scale data for these element-based pipelines as well. Now, I'll talk a little bit about our real-world deployment efforts with CAST, Center for Admixed Science and Technology, which is an NIH-funded center at Yale and UCSD. And the center is focusing on studying the genetics and social determinants of health for underrepresented populations, in particular admixed individuals with multiple ancestry backgrounds, like what I'm visualizing here on the slide. And the main challenge with these studies is that sample sizes tend to be limited in existing data sets. Here's one example with UK Biobank, where you can see that most of the individuals are of European descent. And if you count the number of people with multiple ancestry backgrounds that we would like to account for in our studies, it's only a small fraction of the entire data set. So one of the goals of the center was to be able to use these secure methods to jointly analyze data in multiple repositories. And to this end, we're currently working on a cross-biobank study that analyzes data jointly between two of the largest biobanks in the United States. So Million Veteran Program, or MVP, by Veterans Affairs, and the All of Us Research Program by the NIH. So both these resources are fairly large. They include hundreds of thousands of participants, including both genomic and linked health records that we can study for GWAS as well. But the well-known limitation here is that given the size of these data sets, they're also held in highly restrictive environments. So this MVP data, for instance, it's limited to PIs at the VA and their approved researchers. The All of Us data, it's open to everyone through access control, but using the data is limited to the cloud-based analysis platform called the Researcher Workbench. So our idea was to demonstrate that we're able to jointly utilize these resources, very valuable resources, using our secure federated algorithms. And this is what we were able to do recently in this demo. So this is a GWAS study of height as an example phenotype. We were focusing on the Black or African American population, of which there were around 36,000 samples between the two data sets. We analyzed around 1 million variants, and we included all the standard covariates, including age and sex. And additionally, we were also able to compute these principal components that I mentioned that account for population confounding in the cohort. So typically, computing this jointly between the data set is not possible, but we were able to do this using our secure method. The results are shown on the right side here. So we're comparing the joint analysis to analyzing each of these data sets individually. You can see that the number of significant loci that we're able to identify is greater when we put the two data sets together, which is quite promising. the overall runtime for this initial demo analysis was around 7 hours, so still quite manageable. And we're currently working on a more expanded study where we're looking at clinically relevant traits other than height. Last year, we launched this web server called SFKit, and this is our way of trying to help the biomedical community more easily access these secure cryptographic tools for collaboration. So this is a service where the users can bring their own data sets, GWAS data sets, or other types of genetic data, and either use resources in commercial cloud services like Google Cloud Platform or their own local computing machines to be able to run these collaborative protocols that I mentioned to you. All of the components of the service are open source. And this is, in fact, the service that we used for the demo cross-vibing study that I just mentioned. And currently, we're integrating this into other more commonly used cloud-based platforms, including Terra, which is developed at the Broad Institute, and the All of Us Researcher Workbench, which is actually based on Terra. Now, in the last few slides, I will briefly go over some of our recent work that I think
Excuse
are,
me, can you wrap up?
yeah,
Because I'm around 25 minutes and we want to have some discussion and give Kristen
okay,
time to also present and have a little bit of discussion. Thanks.
okay, sure. Yeah, I'll wrap up in 1 minute. I'll just briefly go over these. So these are some quick vignettes of our related work. So this is a new secure federated method for finding genetic relatives across data sets. And we introduce new techniques to be able to scale this to large data sets, including hundreds of thousands of individuals. This is a different line of work where we're using secure hardware-based approach for secure analytic services, where we were able to develop this genotype imputation server based on the Intel SGX technology that achieves very high accuracy that matches with the state-of-the-art tools in a way that's currently difficult with HE operations, but with weaker security guarantees than the cryptographic methods. And lastly, this is our work on looking for new privacy risks. So we've worked on transcriptomic data privacy and also the privacy of these imputation panels that are used by imputation servers. So there are these new types of risks that are being uncovered, and I think these types of work will be important in terms of guiding future efforts to developing these secure solutions by pointing out new areas where such solutions are needed. So I'll wrap up there. I want to thank my lab members, collaborators, and mentors as well for their input and all the work that I mentioned today. And I don't know if you're taking questions now or later, but yeah, I'll wrap up there. Thank you.
Um, let's see. Why don't we take a few questions now in the chat box? Let's see where we can go. Okay, so it was. I think Heidi says how much time and how much cost is associated with federated secure computation in terms of power usage and compute time.
Yes, I mean
What's the
this
cost?
right. This is a very important yet difficult question to answer because it does depend on many factors, right? The size of the data set, the operations, I mean, the analysis pipeline that we're running, what resources we're using, how many CPUs are available, how many parties are involved, what's the distance between different parties in the system. Like all these factors uh, affect the overall runtime. And so we try to vary these different parameters in our paper, and you're welcome to look at the preprint where we have many supplementary figures exploring this question. But I think the bottom line is that these tools are reaching a practical level for many existing genomic data sets, including hundreds of thousands of individuals.
Impressive. Okay. Were you able to account for individuals that may uh, participate in both programs via computation? I am maybe.
I can reach into that a little bit more because we know that, data is de-identified, right? but we also know that there are individuals that may be participating in more than one type of research program. And your example is actually a prime example of that, because Million Veterans Program, VA is actually a site for all of us. And in order to be able to have like good, robust computation, and also, the correct power, et cetera, and everything, and representation, right? We want to make sure that we're not doing like inadvertent like twin or triplicate studies. So I didn't know if you were able to do that in your computation, to be able to do like some type of fingerprinting or something like that, or take that into an account.
I see. So putting multiple data sources together, that definitely increases the risk of re-identification if you're able to link samples between data sets. I wonder if this is what you were referring to. Um,
Yep. Yep.
I
That,
see.
and also, we want to make sure that results that are coming out are actually as accurate as possible, right? So it's like two
Right.
sides of the coin.
Right. So in some sense, I think the cryptographic methods that I was talking about helps to an extent with that concern, because we're not really putting the two data sets together in a raw form, right? We're making this kind of like a black box, if you will, um, that performs the analysis jointly. And at the end, we know exactly which results will be revealed at the end. So then we can focus on what's being revealed in the final analysis outcome, as opposed to, any number of things that's possible in terms of fingerprinting and re-identification, things like that, that comes with combining the data.
Okay, another question is, are there any regulatory consent constraints that come into play with federated secure computation, since you're still distributing the data?
Yes, this is also an important question, and I know JP and others have also looked into this and written on this in the literature. So the key question there is, how do we think about these guarantees that are provided by cryptographic tools in the existing policy and legal frameworks? There's a really big gap there, right? There's not a shared understanding as to how safe it is to use these techniques and whether the guarantees are actually meaningful in legal sense. But I think as we standardize these tools and we agree upon the safety and security of these methods, the concerns will be mitigated, and I'm optimistic that we'll be able to say for certain that using these tools, we're able to comply with the existing policies. And yeah, that's my current view on it.
All right, and for JP Hubel comment, we will come back to it. Where do you see the main obstacles for broad adoption of this approach in the US? And just a technical question, Hoon. So every time somebody decides to collaborate, they need to set up a new, basically fully homomorphic encryption key, correct?
Yes, in general, yes.
Okay. All right. We will now go to, we'll come back to the question that Dr. Hubo raised, and we'll now have Dr. Lauder present. Would you please introduce yourself, Dr. Lauder? And I think you have a new position, but I'm not sure. It's incorrectly, I incorrectly ascribed your position on the invite. Thanks. And you're on mute right now.
That's right. Thank you. So let me see. Let me just make sure that I can share my slides. Should I go ahead and do that first?
Please.
Oh, we should have checked it before.
We got it. Looks great. Now you just have to put it into presentation mode.
Cool. Great. Thank you.
Perfect. Perfect. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm happy to be here. So I'm Kristen Lauder. I am now actually Senior Director of FAIR Labs North America. So FAIR is Facebook AI research. And now at Meta, when I went to the company, it was called Facebook. Now it's called Meta. For those of you who have not kept up. I'm also, I continue to be an affiliate professor at the University of Washington. So today, I've had kind of a long, more than 10-year involvement with the fascinating field of what I call private AI and applications to computation and genomics, so genomic privacy and security. But my background is as a mathematician. I worked leading cryptography and privacy research group at Microsoft Research for about 15 years and built up the SEAL team and released the SEAL code for homomorphic encryption. So I've worked on homomorphic encryption and standardization and security for quite a while. And so I thought I would focus my talk on these topics and some new work that I've been doing in the last 3 years. So the outline for my talk will be that I will first just talk about homomorphic encryption as a tool for protecting privacy. I know quite a few of the other speakers in this series have talked about it. Our previous speaker talked about homomorphic encryption as well. And I'd like to relate that to genomic computation by just giving a short overview of the history of the IDASH competitions for secure genome analysis, and the very related and intertwined effort, the open source standardization effort that I helped to start in 2017, which is homomorphicencryption.org. And actually the standard that we released, actually developed in 2017, but released in 2018. So then the new work that I'd like to present here today has to do with actually benchmarking LWE, which is the underlying hard problem for homomorphic encryption. So that's the kind of quick outline of my talk. So homomorphic encryption, I've used this description many times because people seem to like it. So AKA homomorphic encryption. So this is Homer Simpson. This picks up on the primary use or application of homomorphic encryption, which is for secure and private outsourcing of computation. So the idea here in this slide is that Homer Simpson is a jeweler and you have some gold and you'd like to have some jewelry made, but maybe you don't really trust Homer Simpson with your gold. So you're going to lock your gold in a lockbox here pictured on the right, and Homer Simpson is not looking too happy because he has to work on this gold by putting his hands into this cumbersome lockbox with these gloves. He has to work on the gold in this locked box, and you keep the key and do not share the key with him while he's working on it. And when he's done, he gives you back the box, and then you have the key, you can unlock the box. So the idea here is very much like the idea that I also describe in this kind of mathematical form with this beautiful commutative diagram, because mathematicians love commutative diagrams. And that is that you can take some sensitive data, like, for example, health data or genomic data, and you want to do some computation on it. Maybe you don't have the model that needs to be computed. Maybe you don't have the compute resources to do big computations, or maybe it's simply just too much trouble to manage that compute infrastructure. So cloud service providers today provide an integrated way to both store data longer term and also do all kinds of useful compute, so provide different services. So there's a lot of reasons why you might want to outsource compute on your private data. Actually, some of the examples given by the previous speaker are relevant as well. If you are outsourcing compute because you're essentially going to be interacting with data that comes from, some other party, the computation has to be done somewhere. So either you're outsourcing your compute or they're outsourcing their compute. So there's a lot of different reasons why you might want to outsource compute. And if you're going to do that on sensitive data, one way that we can enable that is with homomorphic encryption. So data can be encrypted. And so you'll see the kind of vertical arrows here. The idea is you have some data, A and B, you can encrypt it, and then you can compute on it. And what homomorphic encryption does is it allows you to get that, to make it so that you get the same answer as if you had actually computed on it locally, and then compare the output with what you would get if you decrypted the result that you got from computing on the encrypted data. So you can go either across the diagram locally, or you can go around, outsource, compute on encrypted data, and then decrypt, send it back and decrypt, and you'll get the same answer. So these are two different descriptions of homomorphic encryption from a high level. One of them focuses more on the functionality, the being able to share your gold with an untrusted jeweler. The second one focuses more on the actual property that homomorphic encryption has, which is that you can either encrypt and then compute, or compute and then encrypt, and you should get values which decrypt to the same thing. So just continuing the very high-level description of homomorphic encryption, the first solution was proposed in 2009 by Craig Gentry. My team at Microsoft Research came up with new schemes in 2011, including the BV scheme and the BGV scheme, which built on the BV scheme. And the LNV work at that time, work with Vinod Vaikunathan and Michael Narig, showed a practical way of encoding data directly in ciphertext, which was much more efficient, both for compute and for the storage costs, or the actual blow up of data that you get when you transform it into ciphertext. So this practical encoding method, already back in 2011, allowed us to do what we call practical homomorphic encryption. A lot of practical computation, statistical computations on genomic data, and statistical computations on other types of health data, which we started implementing, and talking and working with biomedical researchers and people that were interested in statistics on health data. We came to realize that there was a lot of machine learning functions that people would like to compute. And so in 2012, we came up with the ML Confidential paper, which was the first demonstration of actually being able to perform machine learning on encrypted data. So including both training very, very, very simple models and inference. So from there, we were really able to develop the field of what I call private AI. So it took a while, but in 2016, we showed actually being able to evaluate deep neural nets, and the CryptoNets paper in ICML. We were able to do inference. And in the last, I'd say, 8 years since CryptoNets, this field has really exploded. There's so many papers and teams that have worked on being able to evaluate deep neural nets, and to be able to train models such as logistic regression and other kinds of machine learning models on encrypted data using homomorphic encryption. So another really significant contribution there was the Haon library based on the paper, the CKKS paper, which showed homomorphic encryption for arithmetic of approximate numbers. So approximate compute has been a really useful tool, and also continuing to make practical homomorphic encryption more feasible. Very important applications in the evaluation and training of deep neural nets. So the next thing I just wanted to kind of talk about very briefly is the SEAL library. So Simple Encrypted Arithmetic Library was the library that my team built at Microsoft Research during this period. We went through a bunch of iterations, and then finally settled on a design criteria is to make it really usable and robust and stable, like very well engineered homomorphic encryption library. This was actually really motivated by conversations with our colleagues in especially biomedical computation and genomic and health computation in general, because some of our colleagues really asked for a homomorphic encryption library, which would be open source and would be useful for all. And so we took that seriously. We released it in 2015, actually, and the open source release was done actually in 2018 with a joint announcement actually with the team at Intel, who was also working on kind of neural net computations. So you can still access sealcrypto.org, but the main developer, Kim Leine, who was leading the development and the design of this library, is no longer supporting it, and I'm no longer at Microsoft Research. So things have changed a little bit. So I just want to, since this NIH series is focused on, health and genomic data and privacy and security issues, I really wanted to just talk briefly about the IDASH, the series of IDASH competitions, which was funded by NIH and focused on secure genome analysis. So benchmarking a range of different tasks that you'd want to do securely and privately on genomic data. And this was led by a number of people. I apologize. So number of these people have moved, so I don't have quite their right affiliations everywhere, but Dr. Xiaoqian Zhang and Lucia Ono Machado, who were at UCSD at this time, and Lucilla is, my understanding, is now the dean of the medical school at Yale. I hope I got that right.
The two speakers, so.
Yeah. So, oh, sorry, I hear some background noise. So the techniques that were benchmarked in the IDASH competitions, as I said, we've had 10 years of them, so there's quite a range, but primarily for many years now, homomorphic encryption tasks have been benchmarked. Secure multi-party computation, which we just heard a lot about in the last talk. Other techniques such as differential privacy, hardware solutions, blockchain, et cetera, et cetera. And there have been a couple of really nice overview papers on protecting genomic data in the cloud, which have been published by kind of a lot of the organizers and supporters of this series of challenges. So the IDASH challenges, I've just listed some of the homomorphic encryption tasks. But going way back to the beginning, like DNA sequence comparison, testing for genetic disease, secure parallel genome-wide association studies, secure genotype imputation. So all of these were tasks, homomorphic encryption challenges, requiring outsourced compute on encrypted data. So exactly the application that I was talking about in the very beginning, why homomorphic encryption is useful for protecting privacy. A really primary application is for outsourcing compute on sensitive data. So as you can see from the growth of the number of teams that were participating, I had teams that participated in the early days and then flipped over to helping support the evaluation of the submissions. And you can see the number of teams kept on growing and growing. I don't have the data for the recent years on the number of teams, but you can see a wide range of tasks that have been IDASH challenges and have been benchmarked. And some of them, like for example, in the secure outsourcing of genotype imputation, the organizers actually published a really great paper along with some of the teams who had submitted solutions. So really pulled together all the different solutions and published them together in Cell Systems. This was back in 2021. So there's been a lot of really great outcomes from this IDASH series of IDASH competitions. And so I wanted to kind of flip over to really talking about the underlying technology for homomorphic encryption for a few minutes before I then start talking about the security of these systems. So lattice-based cryptography actually goes back to the 1980s. The shortest vector problem was already stated and studied. Kannon's algorithm from the 1980s on studying the shortest vector problem is still used today for the best known solutions for solving shortest vector problem. But there's a more recent proposal, which comes from the early 2000s, which is called learning with errors. And there's security reductions from the learning with errors to approximate shortest vector problem. So even though it is only about 20 years old, it's related to this older problem, shortest vector, which has been studied for around 40 years in the cryptographic community. So lattice-based cryptography today relies on, for its security, on the hardness of this problem, the learning with errors problem. So what you should do is think about this. I have this little picture of a lattice over here on the right, but I hope the picture of the participants isn't blocking it. So this is a tiny little lattice. This is dimension 2. So this is really just to kind of give you an idea of what we mean by lattice. You can think of a lattice as really being a discrete linear subspace of Euclidean space. So think of it as being generated by a number of basis vectors. So here we have dimension 2 lattice and two basis vectors, B1 and B2, which are these maroon vectors. And you can see that they're rather skewed to each other. They have a very small angle between them. And the green vector, which is labeled V, is also in the lattice. It's the difference between these other two red vectors. And you can see that the green vector is much shorter. So the idea in a lattice-based cryptography is that you'll have a very, very high dimensional lattice of dimension n. And you'll have a bunch of basis vectors or vectors that are given which generate this lattice, but which may be very, very long and they may be very skew. And the idea of shortest vector problem is to be able, that's the challenge of finding the shortest vector in the lattice. And the idea of learning with errors is related, but a little bit different and quite simple to state, actually. Learning with errors is simply, as the name suggests, given a random vector A of dimension n, and there's a secret vector, which you don't know, of dimension n, given the inner product of A and S plus some error, so a noisy inner product, which we're going to call B, modulo Q for some modulus, given a bunch of pairs A comma B, can you learn with errors? Can you learn the secret? So the decision version of this problem is whether you can even detect whether these were randomly generated vectors or whether they were what we call learning with errors samples. So these pairs A comma B are often called LWE samples. And so an attacker will be given some collection, let's say M samples, LWE samples, and the challenge is to learn the secret from these samples. So that's why it's called learning with errors. And okay, let's see if I can go to the next slide. So in the interest of time, I'm going to kind of skip over this quickly, but the high level idea of homomorphic encryption is that encryption adds this blinds messages with these noisy secret inner products, and decryption, if you have the secret, allows you to subtract off the exact inner product, A.S, and then you get a noisy version of the message, which you can round to get back to the correctly decrypted message if the error is not too large, if it has not grown too much. So just to give you an idea, for the rest of the talk, I'll be showing a bunch of charts and talking a lot about the actual security parameters. So just to make sure that we all know which my notation here, what I'm using, n is the dimension of the lattice. And so you'll see the examples we'll be talking about is basically n is always a power of 2. For reasons I'll explain in a minute. So n could be 256, 512, but typically for homomorphic encryption, we've started with 1024. So we're talking about lattices that are dimension in the thousands for homomorphic encryption, so 1024 and above. And we have a modulus, which is Q, which keeps everything finite. So all the numbers, all the entries in our vectors are numbers modulo Q, so they're represented with log Q bits. E is the error vector with standard deviation sigma. That is the error that's added when we encrypt, and it's usually selected from a Gaussian distribution with standard deviation sigma. And S is the secret vector sampled from some secret distribution, and that's one of the key points here is that there's a number of different distributions you can select for your secret, including a sparse binary secrets, which some people have proposed and used. And in that case, we call the Hamming weight, H is the Hamming weight, which is the number of ones in a sparse binary secret. All the other entries are 0. And M is the number of samples that an attacker is given. So I just want to point out that LWE in general is not a hard problem. Like if Q is too large compared to N, then we have a classical algorithm called LLL from the 1980s, which can solve LWE in polynomial time. So with Kim Line, I actually have a paper from like 2014 that shows you kind of the boundary of parameters where LWE is easy just using the LLL algorithm, a polynomial time algorithm, and just running in a very short amount of time. So I'd like to just underline that LWE in practice has now been standardized. It has been standardized by NIST in 2022 in the post-quantum crypto competition, and it has been standardized by our community, the homomorphic encryption standardization community, in 2018. So, 2 years ago and 6 years ago, basically. So what you'll see is that in the NIST standards from 2022, there's 2 schemes. I am going to be referring to the Crystal's Kyber scheme in this talk. So there, the dimension of the schemes, and this is for a key encapsulation method, which is used for key exchange. The dimension is 512 or 768. And based on ring learning with errors, which I'll talk about in a minute, with a fixed log Q equal to 12. The Q is like 3,300 something. And with a fixed binomial secret distribution, so it's a small secret, but not necessarily sparse. So it's a binomial distribution for the entries of the secret. Homomorphic encryption, on the other hand, which is the main topic for today, as I mentioned, we use larger dimension, and the log Q, the size of the Q, is also a bit larger, around 30, actually 25. Log Q is 25 and above, roughly speaking. We have, in practice, used binary, ternary, and Gaussian and random secret distributions at different times, that the community has converged primarily towards using ternary secrets. With small Gaussian error with this standard deviation sigma roughly 3.2. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the standards. These secret distributions, small secret distributions, are standardized, but luckily sparse secret distributions are not standardized, but they have been used in practice in some cases. So in the interest of time, I'm not going to go into too much detail about the ring version of the learning with errors problem. It's based on kind of a number theoretic construction, which is a cyclotomic ring. It's a polynomial ring. It just means that it's defined by a particularly simple polynomial x to the n plus 1, where n is a power of the prime 2. So we call these 2-power cyclotomic rings, and these are what are used in practice, both in the homomorphic encryption standard and in the Crystal Kyber setting. And just to emphasize that the security of LWE or ring LWE depends on these parameters that I've mentioned. It depends on N and Q, the dimension and the modulus, and it depends on what secret distribution do you choose and what error distribution do you choose, and also how many samples are available to the attacker. So I'd just like to little walk down memory lane here, emphasize that the homomorphic encryption standardization community that we started in 2017, homomorphicencryption.org. We started at a working meeting at Microsoft Research, where we actually wrote drafts of the homomorphic encryption standard, HES 2018, which has been available publicly online in preprint form on ePrint since 2019, and on the homomorphicencryption.org webpage since 2018. The webpage is maintained by Kurt Roloff and team. We've actually run 7 different workshops. The next one is coming up in Utah in October, which is very exciting. So we have a steering committee, and we continue to plan events. So thanks to all of the current organizers who are pushing things forward. We've had these homomorphic encryption standardization meetings, not only at Microsoft and in industry. We've had them in academic locations, such as hosted at MIT, University of Toronto, University of Seoul. We've had meetings co-hosted by Intel, Infer, and Crypto Labs and Samsung in Seoul. So we've had a lot of industry participation in these meetings. Our standard has also been referred to in various government reports, including starting in 2019 by a UK Royal Society report on privacy enhancing technologies. And in general, it's an open community that and an open standard, so anyone can access it and join the community and participate. So one of the artifacts that we released from this community you can refer to if you're interested. We actually published a book, Homomorphic Encryption, Protecting Privacy Through Homomorphic Encryption. It includes a published version of the standard from 2018 and an overview of all different schemes, written at another workshop hosted by the community at Microsoft Research in 2020, and applications that were developed at the event.
Can you wrap up, please, and so we can open up to questions? Be right.
Yes. Yes. Sorry, I didn't keep track of when I started. So the homomorphic encryption standard from 2018 standardized its parameters. So I'll just look at the very top line. This is for the ternary secret, suggests for various n, like n equals 1024, which log Q, what size of Q can you use? And if you look this spring at a new paper on security guidelines from homomorphic encryption from a wide variety of members of this community, you'll see that for ternary secrets, it hasn't changed much. For 1024, for example, still recommending the size of Q to be log Q equals 26. So all of these kinds of estimates from both of these works are based on what's called the lattice estimator. And the lattice estimator just estimates running times for attacks. So the main thing that I wanted to announce today, and I'll be happy to take questions about this, but is looking at all the different attacks that we have on homomorphic encryption. There has been very little effort to actually benchmark them at scale, so at the relevant sizes for our standards. So this is a list of papers, all the papers that we know of over the last 10 years that have actually done concrete attacks, not estimated attacks as what you find in the estimator. And you can see for the first, 7 or 8 rows, most of them don't even go above dimension 100. So in recent work over the last couple of years, we've introduced these machine learning attacks on LWE and started to attack and benchmark higher dimensions. So 128, 350, 512, and then in the more recent paper from January, 512, 768, and 1024. So the problem is there's very little understanding of the concrete running times of these attacks. And so we've just, this is my last slide. We've just released this paper, or this benchmarking effort. The paper and the open source code will be released shortly, and which actually starts to benchmark all the best known attacks. And the important thing to note here is that these are actually on the standardized parameters. So this is looking actually at Kyber parameters, and this is looking at homomorphic encryption parameters. So for example, n equals 1024, log q equals 26 and 29, which are suggested in the paper from this spring. And the only thing is, so don't worry, we haven't completely broken all of LWE with this paper. Instead, what we're suggesting is that we should be benchmarking the known attacks so that we really understand the security better. And so what we do is we start with small sparse secrets, which is something that I personally fought against standardizing. So these are not in the standard. So the secret distribution is sparse secrets, and these are not in the standard, but they are used in practice at some larger sizes for some particularly difficult computations. So we show recovery of sparse secrets, for example, with like anywhere from 8 to 10 to 12 active bits in a matter of hours. So you can see like this is 34 hours, 49 hours, 21 hours, 31 hours. So this is recovering LWE secrets in a matter of hours on standard parameters. The only thing is this is parallelized computation. So for some of these attacks, we're using, 1,000 machines at a time. And it's also, I want to emphasize one more time, these are sparse ternary secrets. So in contrast, you have the best known before the machine learning attacks, the best known attack previously was actually due to Jung-Hee Qian's team in a paper in 2019, the meet in the middle. And you can see meet in the middle doesn't achieve quite as high Hamming weights, and it requires a lot more memory, and it runs in various times, so 65 hours, 13 hours, this kind of thing. But so we know that meet in the middle scales exponentially badly with memory as you increase the Hamming weight, whereas the machine learning attacks are new and are likely to improve over time. So the high-level conclusion from this is that we need a lot more work on concrete benchmarking for LWE to understand security for homomorphic encryption. For standardized HE parameters, small sparse secrets absolutely should not be used. The current best known attacks on search LWE for standardized HE parameters are machine learning based. So the series of SALSA papers we've been putting out over the last 3 years. The machine learning attacks are new and they will improve over time. And any improvement in lattice reduction, which is the classical approach, it benefits all methods, including the machine learning methods. And our new paper will be available shortly, and we are open sourcing all the code for all the attacks and inviting the community to contribute, improve these attacks, implement other attacks, et cetera. So this is our chance to invite the community to join our benchmarking effort. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Oh, and now open for discussion. First, we'll go for your presentation, Dr. Lauder. So it sounds like you can attack the encryption and homomorphic encryption if you run large enough computers and use machine learning. And that's my simple take-home message. Now, you said that you're introducing a noise. So in terms of sample size, and as you increase the sample size, do you also increase the noise and then decrease the accuracy of your results? And where's the limit?
So I want to emphasize, like, the simplest way to to kind of get around the new machine learning attacks would be to use like a random secret. Or right now, if you use the standardized parameters and you use secrets which are not sparse, which have like either like half ones in the binary case or in binomial distribution, our attacks are not yet feasible on those. So the primary tool that we have right now to make homomorphic encryption robust against these kinds of attacks is to change our secret distribution. A second thing that we can do is what I think you were kind of indicating is that we can change the error distribution. So we typically use Gaussian error, but the homomorphic encryption community started long ago with using small Gaussian error because then the error grows as we do compute. So it's from a practical point of view, we just like to keep the error small, and there were no attacks up until now that were really using the size of the error effectively. So that's another thing you could do is to increase the error, and that will just increase the cost of all of these machine learning attacks. So both of those are effective ways to fight back against these machine learning attacks for now. Is that answering the question?
I think so. But I mean, if you're introducing more error, do you increase more noise, and then you may decrease the accuracy of the return of the result?
No, in the sense that we usually set the error to not be too large. Like if you increase the error, that means you're probably also going to have to increase Q, because you have I had a slide where I was explaining this, but I skipped over it. In practice, in practical homomorphic encryption, you basically decide what task you want to do, how deep is the circuit for that task, how much is your plain text going to grow, how much is your error going to grow, and knowing that, you would set what we call a plain text modulus. And once your plain text modulus is set, that will allow you to do that much compute. What you'll do is you'll make it so that Q is large enough so that Q over T determines the error growth bound. So as you can see, as you increase that error, you're going to be pushing up both T and Q. And so you'll have a larger Q, and then that will push, that'll push, you'll have a fixed Q, and that will push N larger, the dimension. So in order to be able to do the same amount of compute on your data with a bigger error, it just means you'll need to have T, N, and Q adjusted accordingly. And N will be larger, and that makes your whole overall compute more expensive. So that's kind of how it works.
And do you have any estimates for how cost goes up for your different ways of preventing attack?
We haven't done that yet because we didn't use the larger error. Like we actually have shown SALSA working, recovering secrets with larger error. So let me see. I actually think maybe we do have some numbers for how increasing the error affects the attack, but we don't have them I don't think we have them in the current paper, so I'll have to think about that. But for what was the other thing besides the error? Oh, the secret distribution. When you make the secret less sparse, let's say, we don't have numbers because we just haven't succeeded. We're showing the boundary of how far we've been able to go on sparse secrets. So larger H, like larger Hamming weight, we haven't succeeded yet. So if you keep ternary secrets and you just make the Hamming weight larger, I don't have estimates yet for what the attack time will be.
All right. So now back to the chat. So I'm interested. This is from Mehmet Kalia. I'm sorry, I mispronounced. I'm interested in encrypting selected portions of text and making them accessible to authorized people based on their access permission matrix. Are you aware of any tools or research that addresses this issue?
Yeah, so I would like to point to a couple of things. So first, the book that I mentioned that we published, Protecting Privacy Through Homomorphic Encryption, has a lot of different applications, and some of them are related to text. So if it's this sounds like a kind of a standard outsourced computing application where you might want to. So we did a lot of. I didn't show all the demos that I used to show when I was at Microsoft Research, and a lot of them were text based. So like private sentiment analysis of of text, things like that. So definitely there has been work done on implementing homomorphic encryption for text-based applications. Actually was recently talking with Lucilla at Yale, who's talking about like summarization of doctors' notes, that kind of thing, being done privately for doctors and medical practitioners. So it's absolutely one of the applications that can be enabled with homomorphic encryption.
It's open for discussion, and we can come back to Dr. Hubo's comment or question.
Actually, could I ask one follow-up question? Oh, sorry.
Yes.
Go ahead, JP.
Elaborate a little bit on that. Sorry. So, as you know, we have here in Switzerland and in neighboring countries, we have already started to deploy the kind of solutions that you have described, Hoon, making use also of techniques described by Christine. So my question is, in the case of so now we got a good sense, I would say, of the challenges here in Europe, considering the legislation and the habits that the researchers may have, and we see that in the case of both oncology and dermatology, we already deployed, and it seems to fulfill the expectations of the users in hospitals. What is your take on, because we talk a lot about technology because we are technologists, but the crucial thing is actually to put the things in the hands of end users at some point, right? And so in terms of deployments in the US, and also as mentioned by Sue, across US and Europe, where do you see the roadblocks? Are they more technical? Are they organizational? Are they political? Are they related to regulations? I mean, where do you see the highest level of resistance?
And specifically for homomorphic encryption, you're asking about?
Yeah, for the deployment in the case of for biomed data.
Yeah, so one of the things that I think is that, so NIST has been a partner for us on the homomorphicencryption.org community. Lily Chen has been, attending and helping to co-organize to some extent since the beginning. But NIST has not actually run a standardization, effort or challenge specifically for homomorphic encryption. So that's, and it doesn't just have to be in the US. I mean, it could be like European organizations too. I'm not up to date in case anyone's doing something in the European governments, but I think it would really help to have some of these technologies actually standardized by NIST. We have been working, the homomorphicencryption.org community has been working with, the ISO internationally and, IETF and other organizations that standardize cryptographic technologies. And I think that that has been a bit of a barrier that's a bit lagging in terms of the standardization by different government agencies and scientific societies would really help. I think the other thing that we're seeing is that there's a rush towards the data flywheel for using data for improving AI models and things. And so there's a bit of a counter trend that goes against kind of locking down and protecting the privacy of data, which has not been helpful. Excuse me, I'm coughing, so maybe you can go to another speaker.
Hoon, what's been your experience in terms of pulling together different data sets, particularly with all, like All of Us and MVP, which is not really very not access friendly.
Yeah, I have to say I'm not as familiar with like the policy and legal aspects as you are, JP, but I did have a lot of conversations with the organizational leadership at these um, entities in terms of trying to get these tools to be used. And I think a lot of the approvals are being made at the organization level. I mean, we have these policies about privacy and these standardization methods, which are very valuable. But at the end of the day, someone in these organizations needs to review all these materials, right? Like learn about the methods and make a decision that this is safe to use for our data set. And that has been pretty challenging, to be honest. It took many conversations. We're actually still having that conversation with the VA as we speak. So, yeah, being able to say that these techniques are widely used in the community, that the parameters are standardized, I think these are all very helpful things to
Mhm.
mention that will
Mhm.
push the conversation along. But I think on the other side of that is also the perspective of the users of these tools. So researchers, let's say, who want to run these analyses, are they actually interested in running these analyses if the tools are available on their side, right? So that's where kind of the analytical flexibility and runtime issues come to play, I think. And um, yeah, I think I've become more optimistic on that side of things given the progress in these techniques.
So on June 28th, we will have a presentation from NIST on cybersecurity of genomic data. And I guess people can bring up the issues of standardization then. And of course, when we have our meeting on September 6th, where we are trying to basically write a white paper with an overview and the landscape, obstacles for implementation, and future research questions. So,
Excellent. Okay. Excellent. Thanks a lot. Thank you very much.
I want to say that, that was a great segue into our NIST colleagues that are going to be coming to give a talk on the 28th. One other thing that I want to say is, like, we've been having like sidebar conversations about cost being a huge consideration, right? Because that's one thing that researchers are bumping up against, especially in this current landscape for research and the economy. So one of my questions was that, when considering the technologies and putting into practice, is infrastructure a consideration? So I'm thinking about low and mid-income countries that may want to have access but don't have access, things that we could do to help facilitate that type of collaborations, because that's like very fruitful collaborations, especially for things that I'm interested in. I have a special interest in like infectious diseases and rare diseases. So, those are some of the really rich data sets that I would want to work with if I was still at the bench. So I'm thinking on behalf of those small researchers, or even here within the US, right? So
yeah.
the smaller institutions.
I mean, like HBCUs, a lot of effort right now is going into, big data and data analysis. And what it would be, what are the costs to a lot of these smaller institutions that are under-resourced? And would they have the resources and capability to take advantage of this type of homomorphic encryption without, breaking the bank?
Well, if I could again give a little bit of a plug for homomorphicencryption.org. So if you go to our webpage, which, as I said, is maintained by Kurt, who's here on the call, you find a list of all of the open source homomorphic encryption libraries that are available. So this is available freely worldwide, to everyone. I talked about Seal because that was the library that my team built, sealcrypto.org. Anyone can download that library. There's a certain amount of compute needed to actually run big computations, but depending on what you want to do. I'm just very proud that the homomorphicencryption.org community has made these resources available, freely worldwide. So I think that's at least a starting point to what you were asking for.
One more technical question, and then I think we'll end. And so when you do local computation, are you generating sort of summary statistics and then putting them together? So I'm thinking that you might get a different outcome if you had all the data together and you were doing the computation on all the data versus some of the data, sort of like, I think I forget the problem, but depending upon how you do the computation, you could get a different result. I'm thinking of like, it's like the difference between doing the popular vote in the United States versus one state you win or all, right? So is there a difference in outcome or not?
So I think that's one way of thinking about it, computing these local statistics and then combining them across different sites. But it's a little more general than that, right? So these are kind of the results of computing individual steps in the protocol. So like if you're multiplying A times B times C, let's say, it could be the result of A times B or B times C, like these smaller expressions that we're trying to compute globally.
Mm-hmm.
So a little more general, but the same concept. But the way we design these methods is such that we like the global thing that we're trying to compute stays the same as what we actually want to compute. So we're not actually changing the computation.
Okay. Thank you all. Thank you very much. And keep thinking about, for all the invited participants and for September 6th, keep thinking about, how, what you want to basically put down on paper. And I will start sending out some ideas and, just start kind of outlining, your thoughts so that we can actually have something productive on September 6th. So thank you all for joining, and thank you, Dr. Hoon and Dr. Lauder, for giving great presentations. So until I think it's our next presentation is next week, and it will be Ro Kamarota and Li Xiong and Abel Ko, and we'll see you next week, same time.